Madam President, I come to the floor today to oppose H.R. 23. This is a bill that levels unprecedented mandatory sanctions on the International Criminal Court, the ICC. I understand my colleagues' concerns about whether the court has jurisdiction over Israel, and I share those. I agree the court should not focus its resources investigating U.S. service members. I can't believe anybody in this chamber wants to see that. But the way this bill is drafted, sanctioning the ICC will not get them to withdraw the arrest warrants for Israeli officials. It could actually have the opposite effect, hardening the court's position. These sweeping sanctions we are about to consider are an incredibly powerful tool, and making this an issue that frankly goes beyond Israel and the United States and stretching around the world is not going to be helpful to our national security. These sanctions will make it almost impossible for the United States to engage the court on other issues in our national interest, whether that's prosecuting the atrocities in Sudan, or human rights abuses by the Taliban, or in Venezuela, or Russia's war crimes against Ukraine. This bill would target the civil servants who work at the ICC, and not just them, it would target their families. Lower-level workers who provide administrative, paralegal, research, even catering and sanitary services would be affected. It could target their family members just for being related. The bill could also potentially target subsidiaries of major U.S. companies like Microsoft for providing technical services to the ICC, which they may have been performing for a number of years before this bill was passed. And the way it's worded, it's retroactive. It would affect them. Not only that, but this bill targets some of the United States' most important allies. For example, the host country for the ICC, the Netherlands, as well as the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, who are the ICC's biggest donors. And it also includes the citizens of those companies who work at the ICC. These alliances are one of America's greatest assets. They make us stronger and safer. And this bill could do real damage to these relationships. It could undermine vital multilateral organizations and hurt U.S. strategic interests. So, Madam President, I was hoping that we could come to an agreement. We've been negotiating with Senator Cotton, who's the author of this bill. I know we share most of the same concerns that he does in drafting the bill, but I think it's overly broad. It's not drafted in a way that addresses what I think are the unique concerns that we have with respect to the International Criminal Court. So, sadly, since we have not been able to come to an agreement to address those concerns, I intend to vote no on this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same on the motion to proceed. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Arkansas.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to calendar item number 3, H.R. 23, be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to be able to complete my remarks before the scheduled vote.
Without objection.
Madam President, the so-called International Criminal Court is a major threat to America's sovereignty and our troops. That threat was clear from the court's founding in 2002, 23 years ago. It's why the United States never agreed to its jurisdiction. It's why, in the same year, Congress passed the American Service Members Protection Act, also colloquially known as the Hague Invasion Act, a law which authorizes the President to use all means necessary to release our citizens detained by the court. 23 years is a long time, but we still have some senators in the chamber who voted for that bill, including none other than the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer. Senator Wyden also voted for it. But even that hasn't stopped The Hague from targeting Americans. Under President Obama, the court threatened to investigate American soldiers in Afghanistan. It did so again in 2020 under President Trump. To this very day, the ICC has an open investigation into U.S. troops who risked their lives to fight against terrorism. To be clear, the United States is not and will never be a member of the International Criminal Court. Yet this kangaroo court continues threatening to haul our citizens in front of foreign judges, judges who have no jurisdiction over our Americans and who do not follow basic rules of due process provided for by our Constitution. The State of Israel is another non-party to the court in The Hague, where anti-Semitism is regrettably alive and well. Although Israel has never consented to the court's judgment, the ICC issued arrest warrants for the leader of Israel and its former defense minister last November. By asserting jurisdiction over a non-member, the ICC has grossly violated the Rome Statute, the treaty that created the court. The court also broke its own rules against prosecuting individuals under governments with functioning criminal justice systems, like Israel. I also would note that the court has not issued arrest warrants for flagrant human rights abusers like, I don't know, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, former Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, or the genocidal president of China, Xi Jinping. The court seems to prefer targeting democratically elected leaders instead of terrorists and despots. It's no secret that the court's targeting of Israel is a trial run to go after Americans. If they succeed against Israel, America will be next. That's why Congress must guarantee any acts of aggression by this court against our citizens and our friends will be met with a swift response. Our illegitimate Court Counteraction Act would sanction ICC officials involved in prosecuting any American, Israeli, or other allied citizen wrongfully targeted by the court. It would also revoke their visas. This act is a targeted and justified response to the constant threats of this court against our troops and our allies. That's why more than half of Americans said they would support sanctioning this court. It's also why every House Republican and 45 House Democrats voted for the bill earlier this month. Now, despite this broad bipartisan and public support, some of my Democratic colleagues still have concerns. So let me put their minds at ease. First, some have called the sanctions in this bill, quote, draconian. Far from draconian, these same property and visa restrictions were used by the Obama and Biden administration not once, not twice, but 49 times. Others have said the bill could target our allies. The bill, however, clearly is directed at foreign persons, not foreign nations. Okay, but still others have said the ICC bill targets, quote, citizens of our allies. Yes, if you are involved in illegitimately targeting Americans, you could face sanctions. This bill does not, once again, sanction foreign nations like the United Kingdom. But if British nationals at the court are targeting American citizens, you better believe they could face sanctions. Still others say it would undermine our alliances. Yet again, the bill only targets officials directly involved in action against the United States and our allies, not foreign nations. Furthermore, if passed as prologue, all of our allies will stick with the United States. When Congress passed the Hague Invasion Act in 2002 with Senator Schumer's vote, all of those nations entered agreements with us to continue their relationship with us, not with the court. Still others say that this would target foreign subsidiaries of American companies. I have worked with Senator Shaheen in good faith, and I commend her for her work with me on that over the last few days. It seems to have become clear, though, that these American subsidiaries don't want a narrow carve-out. They want a massive carve-out that would, in fact, allow them to continue in the future, say, providing information about American troops' actions in Afghanistan, which we do not think they should have. Again, every Republican in the House voted for this. 45 Democrats in the House voted for it. 2 Democratic senators who were in the House last year voted for it. Last April, I led several of my colleagues in a letter to the court's prosecutor, Karim Khan. The letter warned him against issuing arrest warrants to target Israeli leaders. We said, if you target Israel, we will target you. Despite this clear warning, he proceeded anyway, a gross insult to our friends in Israel and an even more dangerous threat in the future to American sovereignty. He and his court should now face the consequences, and I urge all of my colleagues to vote on this motion so we can continue debate on this critical legislation?
Madam President.
The Democratic Leader.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, Madam President, I have spent decades watching the International Criminal Court with a critical eye. From the beginning, even when I was in Congress, I was certain that the ICC would display the same anti-Israel bias that permeated the UN and other international organizations. Unfortunately, I believe subsequent years have proven me correct. While the ICC has undeniably done some good work, including going after President Putin and addressing atrocities in Darfur, their anti-Israel bias has taken over and become too much to ignore. Last May, 7 months after Hamas's horrific attack on Israel, the ICC made a shocking announcement. Instead of going after terrorist organizations who ordered the murder, rape, and abduction of innocent Israelis, the ICC's prosecutor chose to equate those ungodly actions with the justifiable response of the Israeli government. I know that's hard to comprehend, so I'll say it again. Last May, the ICC equated the Hamas terrorist organization with the Israeli government, betraying an anti-Israel bias that cannot be ignored, a bias that is deeply rooted, sinister, and which fuels the anti-Semitism resurging across the globe, including here in America, the country I love. It's hard for me to comprehend even today. And that false equivalence, I believe, is the reason we are here on the Senate floor considering an ICC sanctions bill. The ICC bill is one I largely support and would like to see become law. However, as much as I oppose the ICC's deep bias against Israel, and as much as I want to see that institution drastically reformed and reshaped, the bill before us is poorly drafted and deeply problematic. It'll have many unintended consequences that undermine its primary goal. The bill as drafted would enable sanctions against American companies who have contracts to support the ICC's technology functions. These American companies do not make investigative or prosecutorial decisions. These American companies' employees do not recommend nor bring cases. These American companies do not demonstrate the same anti-Semitic bias that the ICC does. But the work of those companies does defend the ICC's computer network against Russian hackers who would like to expose witnesses who have shared information about Russian atrocities. A small fix could have been made to protect the work of those companies, but the Republican majority refused to make such a fix. The bill as drafted would also allow President Trump to arbitrarily sanction the heads of state of our allies. They all called and complained about that part because their countries are members of the ICC. During this time of world tumult, that's an unnecessary burden to place on our allies. By sanctioning our allies, this bill as drafted would hamstring the ICC's ability to go after Putin for his war crimes, giving him the best gift possible. Again, a small fix, which Senator Shaheen tried to get, would easily have addressed this concern. These fixes could have easily been made, and Lord knows Senator Shaheen tried to fix them. You see, once Leader Thune brought this to the floor, I asked Senator Shaheen, the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to try to work with our Republican colleagues to address some of the drafting errors. Not changing in any way the way the ICC should be taken to task for the way they go after Israel, but these other changes unrelated to Israel. She and her staff worked tirelessly to find a way forward. But the Republican majority, the senator from Arkansas, refused to make these simple changes. Therefore, because they have chosen this partisan, non-consultative path, I will oppose the cloture on the motion to proceed, with the fervent hope that the other side will realize their error and their careless drafting and resume real conversations with us. A bipartisan agreement is still very possible, and we hope and urge our Republican colleagues to sit down with us and come up with a bill that addresses the very real problems at the ICC without adversely affecting American companies and our allies. And I ask for the yeas and nays. Go ahead.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to counter number 3, H.R. 23, an act to impose sanctions with respect to the International Criminal Court and so forth, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 23, an act to impose sanctions with respect to the International Criminal Court engaged in any effort to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute any protected person of the United States and its allies shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Rakowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fetterman, Fisher, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Coons, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kelly, Markey, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Warner, and Wyden. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Kim, no. Ms. Slotkin, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. King, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Ms. Cantwell, no.
This vote, the yeas are 54 and the nays are 45. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to.
The senator from Alabama.
January 2025 has been a turning point for the United States of America. President Donald Trump's inauguration marked the beginning of, as he put it, a new golden age for America. And our new president unveiled a list of executive orders undoing 4 years of decline in his very first week in office. He's already reversed a number of the failed Biden-Harris policies that weakened both security at our border and enforcement in our immigration laws in our nation's interior. He's taken action to end catastrophic catch and release policies. He reinstated Remain in Mexico. And he stopped the abuse of immigration parole. Not only did President Trump turn our country's border and immigration policies around 180 degrees on his very first day, but finally, at long last, Congress is working again. The House and the Senate sent the strongest immigration enforcement legislation to the president's desk since 1996. After nearly a year of working to get the Laken-Riley Act through, it is finally mere hours from becoming actual law. We are finally on our way to ensuring that criminal illegal aliens are off our streets before they can commit the most heinous crimes imaginable. Providing our states the ability to compel the federal government to do its job is something it also includes, and the enforcement of the laws that are actually on the books. Far too often, we hear from grieving parents whose children's life were cut far too short by illegal border crossers, who were poisoned by fentanyl brought across our southern border, or who were suffered abuse at the hands of people who shouldn't have been in our country to begin with. The American people have heard enough of those stories, and on November 5th, they told us they wouldn't take it any longer. The results of the November election were a signal from the people we represent to the lawmakers meant to act on their behalf. They were a verdict from the American people that Washington had for far too long become guilty of overlooking the problems that actually matter to the people we're here working for. With the Laken-Riley Act, we've started to deliver on that verdict, but we're not done yet. The Laken-Riley Act addresses the important problems of criminal illegal aliens already inside our country. But interior immigration enforcement is only one aspect of the problem we face. There's another priority we must focus on: preventing criminals from entering our country to begin with. That's why I've reintroduced the Wall Act. It is long past time to finish construction of a wall on our southern border, and this bill would put us on the path to doing just that. It would appropriate funding necessary to finish the wall, and it would allow President Trump to do so without raising taxes on U.S. citizens or increasing our national debt by a single cent. In fact, we would fund the wall by fixing yet another issue with our immigration system. We would eliminate taxpayer-funded entitlements and tax benefits to illegal aliens. Not only would taxpayers stop having to foot the bill for illegal aliens, but we would also close the loopholes that illegal aliens are taking advantage of. Meanwhile, the benefits intended for citizens and legal residents would truly only go to citizens and legal residents. Solving another problem, the Wall Act would impose monetary fines on illegal aliens and immigrants who overstay their visas. We'd finish building the wall, and we would save money while we're at it. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimated in 2018 that enacting the provisions in the Wall Act would save us $33 billion over 10 years. The bill would save us both dollars and lives. And what could be more important than the task of keeping our country safe and restoring financial responsibility, Mr. President? Just like the Laken-Riley Act, the Wall Act is common sense. And most importantly, it delivers to the American people what they've demonstrated they want, need, and deserve. It's the first move towards making sure that our immigration enforcement and border security agencies have the funding they need to carry out the will of the people. We must fund construction of the border wall, but we can't just stop there. As the chairman of the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, I am committed to ensuring that the Trump administration has the detention space they need to get criminal illegal aliens off of our streets, and providing funding for CBP and ICE enforcement and removal operations. So these agencies have the personnel, resources, and technology necessary to fulfill their missions. And that, Mr. President, is a long time coming too. As long as civilization has existed, both leaders and citizens have understood that the most important role that the government has is to provide security for the people who live under its jurisdiction. From the White House to both chambers of Congress, the Republican Party is committed to getting our country back on track, to responding to the demands of the American people that they made to us this last November, securing our border, removing criminal illegal aliens from our streets, and providing a safe, orderly nation for the American people. There is no greater responsibility we have, no higher calling we can seek than making America safe again. We've heard the American people's voices, and we understand the call. Now let's heed that call and pass the Wall Act. Let's continue to turn our promises made into promises kept. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, the government shutdown that Donald Trump just ordered is illegal and unconstitutional. He is not a king, and we do not live in a monarchy. It is Congress's authority to decide on federal funding. The power of the purse is the foundational funding of the Article I branch. Everybody talks like that. Everybody says those things, But now we are all put to the test, Democrats and Republicans. Are we going to forfeit all of our power? We're the elected branch. We make the laws. And the President of the United States just ordered a funding freeze for stuff he doesn't feel like funding. That is literally not how it works. And today, the White House press secretary was asked about specific popular, essential programs. And you know what she said? She said, have those people talk to Russ Vought and make an appeal to him. Now, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, Russ Vought doesn't get to decide in an appropriations law which parts of the law to follow and which parts not to follow. Second of all, let's be really clear about this. Russ Vought is not a government employee right now. He's a nominee to lead the Office of Management and Budget. And so we're supposed to have, I don't know, Medicaid recipients, VA home loan recipients, nursing homes, education organizations, healthcare organizations, transportation contractors, like, appeal mercy to the king. Will you please release these dollars? That's not how the American system works. This is illegal. There is real pain starting today because of this funding freeze. Schools, child care facilities, fire departments, community health centers, domestic violence shelters, all of them will instantly lose their funding at 5 p.m. today. Because somebody said, we're fiscal conservatives. You want to enact a fiscally conservative appropriations bill? Pass a law. Pass a law. I also would like to select the federal funding, which I agree with, and fund that, and select the funding that I disagree with, and defund that. But I'm not a monarch, and neither is Donald Trump. We're hearing from so many constituents across the country, and I had a bit of a time delay because it's earlier in Hawaii, but all of my colleagues were getting incoming texts and calls and panicked people. This isn't about some arcane government program. This is like basic stuff. People are like staged to do construction and told not to show up for work. Some of these construction projects are in places where you only have a narrow window during which you can even do construction. So a 90-day freeze means wait till next year. I don't care what the law says. Wait till next year.